Good evening, everyone. We are continuing with our Bhagavad Gita commentary from the essence of the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, help us to feel your guiding presence, to know that we are on the right path because it is the path followed by you, from delusion into light. Guide us and inspire us. Take us home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen. Let's just have a moment of silence before we start. Om. Peace. Amen. All right, great souls. We are on chapter 4 of the Gita, and we're in the chapter called The Supreme Science of Knowing, which is chapter something in the book. Let me just see what it is, just for curiosity. In the book, it's chapter 16, but we're still in only chapter 4 of the Gita. The Gita has 18 chapters, just so you'll know. I would say we're a third of the way through. So we are at number 4, stanza 18, and we have a few that we read together here before Swami starts commenting. And we are in the section of the Gita about right action and about this wonderfully subtle reality that when a man of self-realization, when a person of self-realization loses identification with their ego self, even though energy continues to flow through them, it's the energy of the cosmos, it's not personal, so we have this action versus inaction and all these wonderful words, which is it's really great fun to try to think about it. Every time I read it, I understand it a little bit more. I'll just stop for a second here. At a certain, because Swamiji was so dedicated to trying to explain the spiritual teachings to anyone who was receptive, he dedicated himself always to try to think of ways to take subtle ideas and make them known. Make them comprehensible is what I mean. He said, let's see, how did he put it? He says, even though I know it's not true, I pretend to believe, or I like to believe, that if I could just explain it clearly enough, every single person in the world would embrace the path of self-realization. It's a plausible fiction that he worked with because it gave him, as he put it, the incentive to always find new ways to explain things. And once he came up with, when we would come up with an image that really worked for him, he was always so happy about it. And one of the images that he really liked had to do with the illusion of time. You've heard me say this before, some of you. And he would describe this whole thing about this planet where nothing moved, nothing changed. There were no moons, there were no suns, and just this barren planet. And he then would explain this whole thing about time. And he thought it was so crystal clear. He was just exhilarated. Even to this day, I can't even say it because I can't remember it. Every time he would start it, I would say to myself, this is the time I'm going to actually understand it. Because usually when he would come up with those vivid images, I could follow them. I've never been able to follow that one. So I have to say, this whole section about action, inaction, and the man of action who doesn't act and all of that, I actually had a glimmer of understanding of it today. So I'm going to see if it holds. We'll see what happens. I never learned anything about time, but let's see if I can learn about action and inaction. So, number 418, I'm also saying that because this is why people study the Gita for their entire lives. That's why they study the Bible. All scripture says much more to us than the words say. So we just go over it and we hear those same words, but as our own vibration refines, suddenly the more subtle meaning of those words just comes into our awareness, or it translates from being mere intellectual to being actual revelation or perception. So that's what we're working with here. Chapter 4, stanza 18. He is a yogi of true discernment who sees inaction in action and action in inaction. He is wise among human beings, for he has attained the goal of all action and is free. We're just going to move right along and see if we can put this together eventually. Swami doesn't comment until several verses later. 4:19. He who never acts motivated by personal desire, whose ego-binding karma has been consumed in the fire of wisdom, such a one alone may be considered wise. You start with, he who never acts motivated by personal desire. Even just that phrase. Not merely, rarely, or anything, but he who never acts motivated by personal desire. There's the story that is told in Autobiography of a Yogi, which is so dramatic, and I've told it often because I think about it. When the policemen, a couple of policemen were pursuing a man they thought was a murderer. They saw a sadhu walking down the road. They thought the murderer had disguised himself as a sadhu. So they began to pursue the sadhu, calling out to him, "Stop, stop," in the name of the police. The sadhu just didn't even acknowledge them. So they ran up behind him, and when he wouldn't relate to their authority, this is how Master tells the story, one of them had a machete, and he struck the man, and he literally severed an arm off in an effort to get him to stop. The sadhu did not flinch. There was no reaction to having his arm severed. He merely leaned over, picked his severed limb off, held it to his shoulder, and it was miraculously healed and restored to his body. Then he calmly turned to the policeman and said, even though the policeman had not explained why he wanted him to stop, he simply turned to him and said, "I'm not the murderer you're seeking." Now, he was conscious enough, the yogi was conscious enough to be able to read the thoughts of the policeman. He was aware enough to be able to pick up his severed arm and put it on him. He knew everything that was going on around him, but he saw no reason to take initiative. He just let the events just flow around him, and he was so much the observer and so little identified with his body, with his safety, with the excitement of the other people, that it just, he never flinched. And I don't just mean that he never flinched when he was struck, but it's like his equanimity never altered. But the whole event happened through him. And that's sort of the confusing part of a lot of this, because a fully self-realized master who has no personal identification, still a great deal flows through them. They're acting out a destiny, and that destiny acts through them But the difference is how they personally relate to it. So let's go on with the rest of them. He who never acts motivated by personal desire, we're reading this one again, whose ego-binding karma has been consumed in the fire of wisdom, such a one alone may be considered wise. Number 420. The wise, having relinquished attachment to the fruits of action, being ever contented and free in the self, do not really act, even if they appear to be intensely busy. And that's what I was saying before, where the energy flows through Swami Kriyananda's words, which actually are quite, they're quite a doorway into a deeper understanding, was saying, he said, I never identify with Swami Kriyananda. Kriyananda is an event for which I am responsible. Now, because we live inside our bodies, and because our perspective in life tends to be from resting, the ego identity rests at the medulla, and from the medulla we gaze out forward through the eyes, and we see the world resting in the medulla. That's how the average person lives. The God-realized master, the highly advanced saint, has moved his sense of self-definition from ego identity to attunement with the spiritual I, which is still individuality, but it's individuality of knowing ourselves to be one with the infinite, meaning individuality in that he's still participating, he's still acting. But when we live from the ego, what we do and how we act and the consequences of those actions, we still are under the illusion that I am a separate wave, that I am, even though I am a wave of the ocean and I am made of the substance of the ocean and my origin point is the ocean itself, and even though I appear to be separated, I've never actually become anything other than the ocean. It's just a movement on the ocean. It's not an actual state of separation. But as long as I define myself as the ocean, as the wave above the ocean, and am not conscious of the whole ocean, then everything that happens to that wave, it seems to happen to me. And because there is that ego identify with it, it does happen to us. The consequences of it affect us personally. We see ourselves in the light of our past and our present, and then we create a future in which that continues. But the wise, enlightened soul sees that there's a wave, but it always knows that that wave is identical with the ocean. And it's just a movement of the ocean, and it never imagines, or it's seen through the illusion that wave has an independent life. So the surging energy of the ocean can still move through it. The wave can still exist. But the wave itself sees itself as one with the ocean, where the man who lacks wisdom, the being who lacks wisdom like myself and most of the rest of us, we just still think that wave is a separate reality. We can know intellectually that it's not. I can understand the philosophy, but my instinctive reaction, if the policeman was yelling at me and cut off my arm, I would feel like something had happened to me. I was very impressed. It was many, many years ago now, in a negative way, but I was very impressed. In 1989, when there was the last time there was a serious earthquake here in the Bay Area, which when I think about it being 30 years ago, I wonder when the next time there'll be a serious earthquake is here. But it was big enough to cause some real damage. And I was inside a wooden building, a 2-story wooden building. I was on the ground floor when it began to shake. And I remember thinking that the problem was that the building was shaking, which is what you would naturally think. If you're inside the building and the walls begin to shake, my inclination was to get out of the building, which was easy to do because I was on the ground floor of a small apartment. I ran out, and I ran out into the center area of our courtyard, and I watched the grass undulate, and I watched the trees doing things I'd never seen trees do before. And I looked over at the swimming pool area, and I watched a great deal of the water in the swimming pool come up like a little tiny tsunami, just like that, and come over the fence onto the undulating grass. And it was the part that didn't impress me about myself was that I was frightened and I was discombobulated, and the first thing I didn't think was to just surrender to Divine Mother and to do whatever she wanted. I wanted it to stop with my, insofar as and it was only, the whole experience was, I don't even know if it was a minute. Earthquakes can be very fast, but they're very intense. It wasn't long in time, but my entire response to it was resistance. It was mental resistance to the fact that it was even happening, and it was emotional resistance because it was frightening. I didn't know what it was going to do and what was going to happen next. It was quite impressive. People afterwards talked about how, they immediately went into mantras and prayers, and I had to admit that it wasn't exactly what happened to me. But it was also enormously instructive, because no matter what we think with our minds, there's an instinctive response. When I've been in a car and there was a near miss, something happens that's a little frightening, the way the body clutches up and the spirit clutches up, none of that is admirable spiritually, because I'm identified with it. And I feel that if something happens to the body, something is going to happen to me. And Swami says here, how does he put it? The wise, having relinquished attachment to the fruits of action, meaning they act, but the fruits of action is, let me think how to say that. Well, it's having a desire for a certain outcome and wanting an outcome to be in a certain way. That doesn't mean you don't work for an outcome. But once you have worked for the outcome, it's a matter of no consequence to you which way it goes. Now, but do understand me, because it's a very important point to understand. We are deeply committed to acting according to certain ideals, to carrying on a commission from the masters. I mean, the life that I've lived my whole life has been deeply dedicated to sharing what Swamiji taught me with as many people as I can who will listen to me. And I put out as much energy as I am able in the most carefully considered way that I can in order to accomplish that goal. So what the difference between what we're trying to talk about here is when you're detached from the fruits, you are not uncommitted to the effort. You can be completely committed to the effort. In fact, you have to be completely committed to the effort. This is where this inaction really comes in, and we've talked about some of it before in this commentary already, so I don't have to go there. But when you're detached from the fruits, it's like you do your best, but you know God is in charge. And whenever that reality comes through, it's such a different feeling. I've been involved in something recently in which there's a lot at stake, and it's a bit complicated, and it's taking a lot of hard work and intelligence, and there was a little bit of a snafu, and actions were taken that weren't planned, but then they happened. Then they had the negative consequences that was to be anticipated, which is why they weren't planned. Just things go wrong. That's the fun of a community, is that you have lots of people in it, and everybody does what they're doing all the time. And sometimes it's all coordinated, and sometimes it isn't. And I had a very interesting experience, which was, even though it was precisely 100% what I wouldn't have done, and it had precisely 100% the negative consequences that I knew it would have, I had an unusual and very positive feeling that Divine Mother had done what she wanted to have done. Now, of course, that's always true. Whether it goes well or it doesn't go well, Divine Mother has done what she wanted to have done. And the contentment that is referred to here is ever content and free in the self, is not indifference, but it's content knowing that if I am committed and I do my best, and yet something happens, we just have to take that as Divine Mother's will. Now, that doesn't mean, and this is where people misuse this a lot, every time you meet an obstacle, every time something really untoward is threatening you, that you should just say, oh, well, I guess it's what Divine Mother wants. That's not at all true. When Swami Kriyananda's entire life work was profoundly threatened by another religious organization who wanted a monopoly on Master's teachings and spent literally millions of dollars in over a decade trying to just wipe out Swami Kriyananda's work, to the point where at one point they were trying we'd been pushed in such a terrible financial position, and it looked like Swami might lose control over the copyrights to all his books and music. And we teetered on the edge of that for a period of time. Like everything was going to be taken by someone who was just going to bury it, who wasn't going to propagate it. It was just going to be buried. But Swami did not just passively say, well, I guess that's what God wants. No, he did everything he could to preserve what he had done in Master's name. And in the end, Ananda persevered. I mean, we're still here. We would have been obliterated if it had succeeded. So he was never indifferent. But if in the end, and there was a certain point, it was very interesting, there was a certain point in the legal process, which was all very complicated. I've written about it in my book, Light Bearer, which I highly recommend, both the book, and I'll just hold it up to you. 45 years of experience with Swami, really all about his life. It's really, I have to really say it's a wonderful book because of the subject matter. I did a decent job. Swami guided me in writing it. But the subject matter is what makes it good. Just a sec, I can't get that in. I'll put it right here. But at one point, we were engaged in one portion of the litigation, a portion that didn't all end up going that well for us. In fact, everything about that situation just went against us, just everything. If it could go wrong, in other stages of the 12 years of struggle, things would just roll along really nicely. This was around 1997, 98. Just everything went wrong. And in this house, in the house where Swami was staying during all this going on, this part of it, Swami just said one morning, he said, the law of averages says that at least some things will go your way. He said, when absolutely everything goes against you, you have to know it's Divine Mother taking a hand. Now, even then, do understand, Swami never gave up. It wasn't like he said, oh, this is what Divine Mother wants, and just kind of folded his tent and went home. He just persevered and persevered and persevered. But he accepted the fact that Divine Mother was giving him whatever she thought was appropriate. And he just accepted that. And if it was obstacle after obstacle, I remember another time, years earlier, about 1979, Swami was trying to establish what became Ananda House in San Francisco. And he had gone to spend the summer living in San Francisco, or actually, yes, he lived there. He took an apartment in San Francisco. We had a suburban house. There were like about 17 people living in this like 3-bedroom house. The garage had been converted into a dormitory for women. There were literally, people had pitched tents on the roof of the house. It was just wild. And for a while, Swamiji was living in a motor home that was just parked in front of the house with a long extension cord going in and plugging into the house to give him power. It was quite a scene. And then they rented a 5-story mansion in Pacific Heights, sort of toward the end. But there were many, many obstacles before we got that house. The house was the turning point. But up until then, it was just a slogging effort to try to really make anything happen. And Swami said, if Divine Mother makes it impossible, if Divine Mother made it impossible for us to establish the work in this city, he said, we would just go home. We have a perfectly fine life. We don't need to be doing this. We're doing it because Swamiji knew it was the future of Ananda to move out from the rural community and to go live in the urban areas, which is what we've done since then. So he says, we're doing this because we feel that it's what Divine Mother wants. If she absolutely slams the door in our face and makes it completely impossible, then we'll just go home. That's detachment from the fruits. We'll have put out the very best effort we can. If it doesn't succeed, that's her will. And then Swami said, the problem is Divine Mother makes it barely possible. He said, and as long as she makes it barely possible, you have to persevere. And the history of Ananda is that she's always made it barely possible, but the detachment can still be there. As long as it's barely possible, we have to persevere. The way I think about it in terms of the many years that I've spent trying to develop Ananda in various ways, is the single most important thing is for us to have the right attitude toward what we're doing and to act in everything we do as much as we are able to be in tune with the essential vibration of Master and of Swami. It's like, even if what we do either doesn't last, gets destroyed, or never quite actually gets established, the material expression of something is the last manifestation. The transformation, creativity, it begins on the causal realm, it's energized on the astral realm, and finally it comes out in the material plane. And everything is an expression of the consciousness that is behind it. So if we can succeed on the material plane, which we have to a very impressive extent, whether everything that we have manifested will endure, and for how long, and these are all questions that we can't answer. But as long as we as individuals realize that our first responsibility is to keep our magnetism and our vibration in tune with the Masters. That material success, the only material success that matters is that which is the result and consistent with that right vibration. In other words, we can't compromise. You know, we find this issue is particularly poignant with our schools because it's such an uphill battle to try to re-educate adults as to what true education for children really is. But as long as we remain true to our mandate, then we are building, and we'll see what comes. And this is again where, you know, we're content. We're content to be given the opportunity to try, and we're not indifferent to the fruits of our efforts, which is to say we are committed to what we have set out to do. But if Divine Mother makes it impossible, we'll take that as her will. And it was interesting, I started to say, in this situation that I was in recently where things happened that I would not have wanted if but where just fate intervened. It was very interesting for me because I can always say, oh, Divine Mother had another plan. But it was a very interesting experience because it wasn't just a platitude. I mean, that can just be such a platitude. I can just burble that out at any period of time. It's very easy to say. But I really felt it. I could feel. You know, this is the fruit of persevering on the spiritual path. Things that are just ideas, that are even the right ideas, that one is repeating as an affirmation. They just sort of reached a point where when I honestly said, I would not have done this, I wish it didn't happen, it's going to cause ripples, and then the ripples were really, they did come back. Everything happened just as predicted. But underneath it, I just felt Divine Mother is doing exactly what she wants to do. And whenever the curtain of delusion parts, and even for a minute, the simple truth that maybe one has said 50,000 times is it's a perception. It's not an affirmation. It's not an explanation. It's not something one's saying just to comfort oneself. It's just a perception. And I had the very delightful experience of just perceiving that it had gone wrong on purpose. Now, what the end result of that, as it happens, really, it's not consequential. It wasn't like a big, huge, nothing has happened. It's all just energy moving around. There's been no actual material result. It's just energy moved around and got more dissonant than it might have gotten. But I could feel Divine Mother's hand moving through it. And whenever you can really feel that, one needs to really impress that very deeply on one's heart and mind, so that the next time it happens, and it may not come so spontaneously, one has to really just breathe again and think about this. Because if there's ego detachment, it's like I'm acting because Divine Mother has asked me to ask. This is Mother Teresa's response when asked about how effective she was in helping the poor people, and her answer was, I'm not helping poor people. I'm doing what Jesus asked me to do. And that's how you're detached from the fruits of it. I'm doing this because God asked me to do it. When I was working on trying to make Ananda Village a California city, which was an 18-month project, which was just pretty much night and day, because it was one of those things where we were trying to move energy against great resistance. It was a constant, psychic mental effort. It was like even when I wasn't actually physically engaged, I was always engaged, because there was a field of energy coming this way trying to stop it, and there was a field of energy coming from us trying to make it happen. And I worked hard and fought hard and talked hard and just really worked on it, and it all just ended in nothing. We got nothing. Absolutely total complete bust. And then we could have pursued it through the courts, but we didn't feel that was right. Swami got that feeling first, and then we all just dropped it. And I was like, it was very interesting for me, because when Swamiji decided that we weren't going to go forward, we weren't going to pursue it anymore, and we had a good case on appeal, let me see, that was fine with me. Meaning, I was doing it because he thought it was a good idea. If he really felt that Master didn't want us to do it, I didn't have any argument with that. That was fine. If he was going to make that decision, okay, we're done. And he gave me lots of good reasons. It wasn't just a sort of a waving the hand and saying this is what we're going to do. It had real solid basis for it. In fact, he wrote an essay, which is, this is also in Light Bearer, just talking about how when spiritual groups become political, it can be really a mess. Which he wrote that in 1981, and we've seen what's happened. He said, I don't think it would happen to Ananda, but I understand that it could happen. And for that reason, he said, it's better to keep church and state separate. He said the Constitution knew, the Founding Fathers knew what they were doing. That was essentially his reasoning. Here's the whole point of it. Okay, so I'm doing it because Swami asked me to do it, and because I understand the value of it, but I'm really doing it because he asked me to do it. So now he's asking me to stop. What am I actually doing? And what am I attached to? I mean, God knows I had worked hard to succeed, and I thought it was a really great idea. And it was still, I think it would have been fun if we had succeeded. Ananda Village would be very different today if we had succeeded. So I believed in what I was doing. And then from night to morning, it just was dissolved like that. So what am I attached to? What am I committed to? And after a couple of days, I said to Swamiji, I don't actually mind losing. I don't mind losing, but I really am sorry that our opponents won. It was because they had been less than stellar in the way they dealt with things. And I didn't like having that energy succeed. So it was fun. First I can just stop because Swami asked me to stop because he's my spiritual guide, and if that's what he wants for me, that's what I'll do. I trust him. So I could stop in that way. Then I could stop, okay, we're not going to be a city. It's not going to work. It's done. Some of the people in the community called me Madam the Mayor, so I was never going to get to be Madam the Mayor for real. So that was gone. That was okay. But then I still had this attachment to defeating the people who had opposed us. Very interestingly, what happened after that was I came sick with a really high fever, which I maybe 2 or 3 times in my life. I can only think of 2 right now when I've really been sick like that with a high fever. I just went down with this fever for like 3 or 4 days before it was really done. But when I got up from the fever, when it was finished, it was like, oh, I don't care if they win. What difference does it make? It's like, how detached am I from the fruits of what we're doing? How long did it take me? It took a fever to burn through to get. It felt like that was the last of the karma, whatever it was. My body just worked it out. So that's what the man of wisdom does. And what I'm also saying here is, it's not like we get to it just automatically. We're not necessarily like that sadhu who never flinches. Sometimes we have to process this. What is the right attitude? How do I get to it? What am I learning about myself? I was learning about myself, that I have this really strong samskar of justice. This sort of a revolutionary kind of justice. And I felt that we had not been treated fairly and that our opponents had not behaved ethically or honorably. And it wasn't even that I needed to defeat them. Is that I do not like unethical behavior to triumph. And that was really where I was stuck with it. It wasn't personal. I mean, a lot of our neighbors are really nice people, but they behaved in ways that were dishonorable, and the county had allowed them to, and that bothered me. But then, Asha, this is a world of light and shadow. If you're just going to sit there and wait for everybody to meet your standards, you're going to be upset all the time. And as it says down here, that's not how the wise behave. The wise. That's how it starts. This verse starts, the wise, having relinquished attachment to the fruits of action, being ever contented and free in the self, do not really act, even if they appear to be intensely busy. Now, they don't really act because they never move off their center. They always live in the oneness. And Swami also makes a point, and he says this in a moment, that the state of contentment is not a passive state. The state of contentment is not, and sometimes people think of contentment as like lacking initiative, lacking dynamism. Contentment is a very positive, dynamic state. And it's the same as what we've been talking about. If this is what Divine Mother chooses to do, I'm content with what she chooses, because she says, ever contented and free in the self. I'm contented and free because I'm resting in the self. I can observe, I can respond, I can even appear to act. And this is what he says, do not really act even if they appear to be intensely busy. Of course, I witnessed Swamiji's consciousness for many years, and it was a mystery that had to gradually be perceived. And I feel that, I won't even say even now, but all the time that I've known him, continuing right up to the present, I'm always pondering, what his consciousness really was. What was I really seeing? What was it? What was his inner reality? And this is what I hear. He was ever content within the self, which is, he was never rebelling against God's will. What was given to him, he accepted. And he struggled, though, at times. I mean, he had to dive deeper into an understanding of what was really happening. At one point, for example, the litigation years and the persecution he suffered was a huge part of the way Swami demonstrated for all of us grace under fire and right attitude when severely challenged. When we were in the 97, 98 years, I mean, not a total, but 1997, 1998, during that period of time when everything was going against us, in really ugly ways. We had some really, well, as one of my attorney friends said to me, some people become attorneys for the wrong reason, and because it gives you power and it gives you the capacity to hurt people. You know, attorneys can be quite powerful. So we were caught up with a few of that kind. Fortunately, we also had some wonderfully noble men and women who helped us. But there were a few really bad apples in that. And one of those bad apples was really having a lot of power over Swami. And he became, how would I put it? He couldn't find clarity. And he went away actually to Hawaii for a period of time and really even went so far as to be somewhat open-ended. He didn't make a big point of it, but he wasn't sure he was going to come back. And he went into seclusion and he prayed very deeply because he said to Divine Mother, he said, all that I've ever done, I've done for you. I haven't done it for myself. If you want to take, my lifetime of work and just destroy it, it's yours to destroy. I'm not attached to the fruits of my effort. But he said, why are you using such bad people? Why are you allowing such adharmic people? Adharmic means the opposite of dharma. Why are you allowing such adharmic people to have power over me? And Swami just was bewildered. He just couldn't understand. And he prayed to Babaji about it. Babaji, why are you allowing this? And the answer he got from Babaji was, they are all my children. That's really something to contemplate, isn't it? See, here's from Swamiji's standing on this side. It's like, I've been so honorable, and these people are being so dishonorable. It's like, don't you love me more? I mean, that wasn't actually the question, but that's sort of behind that. Like, and Babaji just says, they're all my children. This is just the karma's just playing itself out. I'm not playing favorites here one way or another. Divine Mother has her ways. Spiritual people, in the short term, do not always triumph. In the long term, they always triumph. Because it's not really what we do in this world, it's the consciousness that we develop from what happens. I mean, many times great saints are martyred. They're just killed by low consciousness people. It happens all the time. Imprisoned, martyred, tortured. There's no promise in this world that it will be nothing but comfort. But in the end, spiritual people eventually come into a state of bliss with God. And those who are against Dharma, who act against the spiritual force, they have to pay the karma off. Eventually it catches up. And God is loving them just as much and helping them through it. Now, for whatever reason, you have the opportunity to behave very badly. And then when the consequences of that bad behavior roll out, Babaji will be there just as much as he was when you were misbehaving. Even when we're misbehaving, God is weeping because he knows what's going to happen. He knows what we're going to have to suffer. It gives him no joy. But if the karmic force is there and this is what has to carry itself out, it's confusing. And it's why a lot of people don't want to follow the spiritual path, because we have to embrace challenging realities. And we do. I mean, that's what it is. I'm certainly I think the last 10 or 15 years of my spiritual life have just been, how do we not shrink from the cold, hard facts of this world and still be able to see things as they are, but then see the bliss through it. There's a natural tendency to sort of just not accept how much of a light and darkness this world is. We just don't want to have it be true. But it is. But the power of it is that that's just the play of light and shadow. That we are content in the self, and therefore we're free. But that contentment is a dynamic contentment. It's the constant commitment that, well, if this is what Divine Mother sends me, this is what I want. And on that same experience, when Swami had that answer from Babaji on that particular question, he also wrote to us, he said, it's not enough merely to accept the difficult tests that God sends you. We have to love those tests. Whoa. It's not enough to merely accept. We have to love them. Because why would we not love them? The way it's come to me, just the words that I've been able to use, Divine Mother is determined to bring me into the state of really being a grown-up. When Swami left the planet, which he did in April of 2013, I just felt like the only grown-up had left the planet. All that was left was us kids. You know, I'm 70-something years old, but I'm just still a child. When I was in my 30s, and when I was 30, and I was in Hawaii with Swami and this other woman of the same age, we were working on editing Swami's book, The New Path. And we'd been working so hard, we decided to take an afternoon off, and we were going to go on a boat ride, because there we were in Hawaii. We'd paid no attention to where we were. So I had to order tickets for the boat ride. I'm on the phone reserving the tickets. How many adults, how many children? You know, Swami was 55, and the two of us were 30. And I just almost had the words out, 1 adult, 2 children. But I realized if we showed up trying to get in for a half-price ticket, they wouldn't take it. So it's almost like I had to cross my fingers, because I felt like I was lying. 3 adults, but not by any actual measurement that counts. But just like a mother wants her child to grow up, she may enjoy the fact that they're children. And my mother said to me so sweetly once, you know, her happiest time was when we were, the 3 of us, were little children, and quote, she had us all to herself. I think that's very dear, actually, that my mother enjoyed being a mother so much. She just loved having us all to herself. But she wanted us to grow up. She knew she didn't want to cripple us and keep us children and have us alter herself. You know, when we grew up to be adults, that wasn't what she wanted. She wanted to see us come into our full reality, realize our potential, and stand on our own. Divine Mother, much more so, because Divine Mother's love is through many lifetimes and is unconditioned by any limitation. God and Guru, that's what they want for us. They want us to be who we're really meant to be. And they're very serious about it, much more serious about it sometimes than we are. But I've really come to understand that whatever happens, even if it's very difficult and very disconcerting and you know, very upsetting to me, if there were any other way to get me from delusion and freedom to freedom, I'm sure Divine Mother would do it. She has no desire for me to suffer at all. As Swami said, that's your imposition on it. God wants you to be happy. But she wants me to be really happy. She wants me to become what divinely I'm destined to become. So that's how I think about it, when that's begun to help me be able to be more content in the self. Which is, if there was another way to become spiritually free, she would take me down that road. And so if this is the road she's taking me down, knowing my limitations, knowing my inability to deal with this or to deal with that, whatever it might be, this must be the way it's going to happen. It has to happen. And you see, you work on your faith from lots of different angles. But what we're really trying to become is contented in the self. Because from that contentment, everything else can follow. So then, now chapter 4, number 21. In the Gita it says, even in doing physical labor as opposed to meditative work, one incurs no karmic limitation who has renounced all sense of possession, who is without personal desires, and whose feelings, chitta, are controlled by the inner self. So here we are again. I love the Gita. It's just so, it's just so absolute in what it offers us. Oh, why didn't I think of that? Not to have personal desires and have all my feelings controlled by my inner self. Swami used to make jokes, tie a string around your finger, note to self, have all desires henceforth controlled by the inner self. I'll put a little string around my finger so that when I forget, I'll remember. But then immediately in the commentary here, Swami says we have to realize that values are directional, which is to say it's not an all or nothing sort of thing. This is describing what we will become, but we get there by a series of very small steps, all of which are facing us in the right direction. And as long as we're moving toward that goal and respect and recognize that goal, and even when we move opposite to that goal, but we know that we're moving opposite to that goal, we're still moving toward that goal because we haven't given it up as a value. So that we work on this from every angle that we can work on it. And we have to be, one of the things that we have to do is we have to keep our energy up. And this teaching of masters that everything is directional is really one of the, there's so many in the way that Master taught and in the way that Swami articulates it. There's just these gems that are really the iron wire that just sort of runs through the chaos of everything that's going around. And one of them is directional. Of course, I cannot have my feelings completely under the control of the self, but I can be conscious of when I have slipped away from that, and I can understand where freedom lies. That's one of the things that has just been beyond the pearl, beyond all valuation, just of utmost value, is the fact that there is a teaching that is consistent, against which everything can be measured. And so even if my life fails to match this Gita verse, I can move toward it. I can be making the effort. Instead of letting my feelings run riot, I can hold those feelings up to the divine self within. What is the ideal attitude here? And even if I'm indulging myself to a large extent, I still know that this will pass. I remember, this is not how I've always been able to behave, but I remember one glorious day. I used to be much more prone to ups and downs when I was in my 30s and my 40s, and I don't know what had happened, and I would express my feelings with tears. And I remember one day I just got so upset about something. I haven't the foggiest idea now what it was. I was upset about something, and I went to my room and I sort of curled up onto my bed to have what women call a good cry. That's a phrase that I'm just going to have a good cry. And I have to admit that there's a certain release in that. It seems to be females are more inclined toward it than men, but sometimes it's just there. I know it's going to happen and it's there. But I remember I sort of curled up on my bed and was about to have a good cry. And I remembered that, a good cry is very exhausting. And after you're done, you're tired and you're sort of out of sorts for a lot of the day. It's hard on you physically, certainly hard emotionally. You look a little drained and your eyes get a little red, everything just like that happens. And I was just about to enter the whole cycle. And it was the oddest thing. It was like I realized that I would just cry and then I would be done and then I would gradually feel better. Then I'd get up and go back to my life. So I thought, why don't you just get up? So I just got out of bed and I just went on to my life. It was like I just mentally ran the whole cycle and just decided, this really isn't worth it. It's not going to take me anywhere. Now, God knows that was more the exception than the rule, but it was a marvelous moment. There's I think they have contests for the most outrageous country western song titles, and this one has actually helped me when I was about to have a good cry. I think about this, so I'm going to put it in your mind too. I've got tears in my ears from lying on my bed, crying my eyes out over you. So you're stretched out in your bed, you're going to about start to cry, and the tears are going to run down into your ears. You start thinking about that, and it's too embarrassing. You just can't go there. But even an effort, even the tiniest effort, is moving in the right direction. You see, we can't help the karma that got us to this point because it's already done. That's, it's like, for this hour was I born. Every error that I've ever made has created a certain karmic pattern that is my karmic pattern, that causes me to react, that causes me to respond, that makes me weak, that makes me strong, makes me vulnerable for incomprehensible reasons because they're just too far back in the past, all of it. And here I am. What can I do about it? I already made all those decisions. I already took all those actions. I already sent all those karmic boomerangs out. And they're just, coming back and coming due, one after another, hitting me in the side of the head. I can't do anything about them. But I have complete decision-making power over how I respond now. Now, I don't have complete freedom. I don't have complete mastery. But tomorrow is the result of today. And this is where Sri Yukteswar's statement in Autobiography of a Yogi is so amazing. He says, everything in future will improve if you're making a spiritual effort now. Now, notice the word is effort. He doesn't say if you triumph over all weaknesses in this moment. He just says you're trying. And that's really all that God asks of us because we're all His children. And He's looking at us. He knows what our past karma is. We just have to keep trying because everything in future will improve if we're making that spiritual effort now. Because, well, there's what they call the first law of holes, Holes. The first law of holes is that if you find yourself in one, stop digging. That's very simple. Just stop digging. So oftentimes we find ourselves in a karmic hole because we're not content within the self. We've set up a certain number of bad attitudes that make me want to go upstairs and, get tears in my ears from lying on my back, crying my eyes out over it, whatever it happens to be at that point. But if I'm making an effort, even the slightest effort, not to do that, then what I'm doing is I'm carving a completely new groove in my consciousness. And sooner or later that groove will triumph. I love realizing that bliss is infinite and delusion is finite. And there's a wonderful story about a master and his disciples and how he was telling each of the disciples, how many lifetimes it would be before they would be free. And he said to one that it was 2 lifetimes or 3 lifetimes or 5. And to another disciple, he said it will be 100 lifetimes before you're free. And everybody was just, it was such a horrible thing, 100 lifetimes. And then that disciple left the room and was outside, and someone went outside to comfort him, and they found him dancing in ecstasy. And the disciple said, join me in my celebration. The master said I would be free. It's like, what's 100 lifetimes? The master has promised I'm going to be free. And then the Guru came and touched him and liberated him in the moment, because it was that attitude and that faith, that was the real power. So that's how we have to feel about it. It makes no difference what we are now. The only thing that matters is which way we're facing, and that to the best of our ability we're moving toward that light. And then our salvation is assured. And when we reach that state of eternity, all time disappears anyway. Swamiji said to us once, one really inspired evening, he said, "You're going to get it right." He was so sweet. He said to this room of about 30 or 40 of us, "You're going to get it right sooner or later." He said, "Why waste a few million years?" And I thought about that when those dark impulses come over me. Why waste all this time? I'm going to get it right sooner or later. Just at least look toward the light, and if possible, walk toward that light. And at the very least, give my allegiance to that light. Because we're all Babaji's children, and he loves us all. God bless.